Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Faith Hillis, and I'm the director of CEERES, and I'm really honored to introduce Sarah Cameron today, who will be giving a talk called Elusive Water, the Life and Death of Central Asia's Aral Sea. Sarah Cameron is an associate professor of history at the University of Maryland, College Park. She is a historian of the Soviet Union whose work has explored how greater attention to the Soviet Union's eastern periphery might challenge conventional understandings of the Soviet field. Her book on the Kazakh famine of the 1930s, The Hungry Steppe Famine, Violence, and the Making of Soviet Kazakhstan, won numerous awards in the United States. It also provoked intense and ongoing discussion in Kazakhstan, where the famine remains a largely forbidden topic, in part due to the country's close relationship with Russia. At present, she is at work on a new book from which this talk draws about the causes and consequences of the demise of Central Asia's Aral Sea. In 2022, she was named a Carnegie Fellow. I would also like to express our gratitude to the Committee on Environment, Geography, and Urbanization, CEGU, which has generously co-sponsored this event. So thank you to Sarah. Again, she'll give a 45-minute lecture, and then we'll have the rest of the time for questions, including questions from our online audience.
Thank you. So thanks to all of you for coming out, and particular thanks to Professor Faith Hillis for the invitation to speak here. I was trying to count it up, and I think we've known each other for more than 20 years. So we go back that far. And I'd also like to thank Mike Phillips for his efforts to help organize this talk. So I'm going to be speaking to you today about my research on the causes and consequences of one of the 20th and 21st centuries worst environmental catastrophes, the disappearance of Central Asia's Aral Sea. I want to stress from the outset that this is very much a work in progress. I've completed a good part of the research for the book. I've also drafted a couple of chapters. It's not a finished product by any means. There's still a good amount of work to do in fleshing out the book's overall contribution and argument. But this does mean that I'm particularly eager to get your advice, input, objections, and so on at this stage. Any comments you may have will be really helpful to me as I work to complete the book. I thought I'd begin here by actually explaining this image that I use, which I took myself. Pretty much almost all of the photos that you're going to see here, I took myself because I went out to these distant places. This one was taken by me on the Kazakhstani side of the sea. I decided that, gosh, I'm going to write a book that really features the fishing industry, and I better understand actually how it's done. So I went out in the evenings. I helped the fishermen set the nets, or rather really watched. And then we went out early before dawn broke the next morning to actually get the nets and bring it in. This is near the village of Tastubek. It's really incredibly beautiful there. This was really the striking for me thing when I went to the region. But I can assure you that the water was very choppy. And we were in a really tiny, rickety boat that had sprung a leak. So I thought, my gosh, is this the end of me here, right, in the Aral Sea? But I'm happy to report that I survived, and here I am. So with this, I'm going to begin. So I want to begin with the sea, because in many senses, the sea itself is actually a central character in my book. The Aral itself is located at the end point of two ancient rivers, which you can see here. They're known as the Amu Darya and the CEERE Darya. They originate in the high mountain chains of Asia, and they're fed by glaciers. And these rivers wind their way across Central Asia before terminating in the Aral. The word sea is actually a bit of a misnomer because the Aral is actually not a sea. It's an endohaic lake, or that is a lake with no outflow. The days here are very long, sunny, and cloudless. Rainfall is really not plentiful here, and the small amount of rain that does fall very quickly evaporates into the air. And we might think of the Amu Darya and the CEERE Darya as the sea's lifelines. They are the chains that determine whether it is going to live or cease to exist. One of the other interesting things, if you follow these rivers, is that power, in some senses or in part, doesn't flow from the north to the south, as you might think of in a typical kind of a colonial model, actually from the southeast to the northwest, which is the way the waters flow. It's quite important who's downstream and who's upstream. To orient you a bit on geography, if you're a bit lost here, you're not alone. Even colleagues in my field in Central Asia have trouble with the geographies I talk about. I want to point out that the Aral Sea itself, it covers, or its remains today cover two present-day states, so that's Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And also, if you look there, you can see Turkmenistan is sneaking in, the present-day state of Turkmenistan. So the Amu Darya Oasis covers the northern part of Turkmenistan. And these are the three countries that I'll be talking about today. And I will return again to the subject of these national divisions and geography later in my talk. So the Aral is a salt lake. And this is a body of water that is found in arid environments like Central Asia. So its composition differs from fresh water due to the high concentration of salt and other minerals. Salt lakes are fragile. They're highly reactive to any type of disturbance. And it's not a coincidence, actually, if we look around the globe, that we see a number of salt lakes under threat. They include the Great Salt Lake, of course, in Utah. Many of you may have heard about Lake Urmia in Iran, Lake Chad in Africa, the Dead Sea. And we might think actually of salt lakes as kind of like canaries in the coal mine, that they're highly reactive and that they warn us in advance of these kind of impending shifts before almost, we can see them, these anthropogenic shifts. Similarly, I want to point out that the choice of the word elusive, the title or working title of my book, Elusive Water, is actually quite purposeful. Due to changes both natural and anthropogenic, the waters of the Aral Sea have risen and fallen actually over the course of its history. If you go back, take you back to this slide, you notice here that I pointed out the modern retreat of the sea. And that is because if we look back in the deeper history of the sea, there have been other retreats of the sea. And in fact, the Aral was always a kind of highly changeable body of water. Russian imperial map makers, for instance, would complain that they couldn't even draw accurate maps of the sea because it was often changing. But in the 1960s, beginning in the 1960s, we see a really important shift. So the Soviets begin to divert the waters that fed the sea, that's the Amu Darya and the CEERE Darya, to boost cotton production in lands further south. And the sea begins to dry up in a way that seems quite different, distinct from previous shifts. And this disaster is very multifaceted, so I'll point out a couple of the effects. Climate, ecology of the region changes. We see massive dust storms, water shortages. People begin to suffer from health problems, a wide array of health problems. Women and children disproportionately affected, and the fishing industry also collapses because the sea gets more saline. It's tough for the same species of fish to live, and the water more generally is disappearing. But with this, here's another view actually of what this looks like, this kind of Encyclopedia Britannica shot. Withdrawals really continue into the post-Soviet era. And in 2017, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres calls the disappearance of Central Asia's Aral Sea, quote, probably the biggest ecological catastrophe of our time because of the extent of the water loss, the climate changes, and so on. So the Aral Sea disaster, its causes and consequences, is the subject of a book that I'm working on right now, tentatively titled Elusive Water, The Life and Death of Central Asia's Aral Sea. Rather than framing the Aral Sea as the short-term product of the Soviet cotton boom, it seeks to explain how and why the people of the sea came to be marginalized, and it analyzes this process of purpleization, which spans several different political systems. Russian imperial rule, Soviet rule, post-Soviet rule, shapes and continues to shape the disaster's course, and I place the people of the region at the heart of the story. So I want to give you here a brief overview of my talk. I'm going to first talk about, how has this disaster been explained or portrayed in the literature? How do I approach the story? Then I'll take a deeper dive into some of my sources, and excerpt from chapter 6, and then I'll talk more broadly about my conclusions. So turning to the first part, how has the demise of the sea been explained? So there really are no books on the Aral Sea based upon archival sources. There's a little bit of scholarship on the Aral Sea by social scientists and other scholars. The bulk of the scholarship has been by scientists, so by chemists, hydrologists, and so on. I'm happy to talk more about some of that in the Q&A. But for the purposes of sort of sketching out the story, I'll say that there are sort of two poles of thought, perhaps, that follow, Cold War models. So for people in the West, the demise of the sea became a kind of paradigmatic Soviet environmental crime, kind of a symbol of what was understood to be the Soviet Union's uniquely destructive relationship with the natural world. And you might pick out, for instance, Al Gore, who actually goes out to the Aral Sea, and he features the Aral Sea in his book. It's the lead case in his book, Earth Out of Balance. If we look inside the Soviet Union, the sea's retreat is primarily depicted as a largely successful effort, actually, to bend nature to the needs of Soviet modernization. So the sea is drained, fishing is halted, and cotton becomes king. Some experts actually talked about the fact that the sea needed to die, quote unquote, like a soldier in the service of battle. By 1983, in part due to these efforts, the Soviet Union becomes the world's largest producer of cotton following China. I think the whole story of cotton production, the cotton boom, if anyone's looking for a great topic to explore in the audience, this is a very under-researched, actually, issue, the Soviet Union's role in global cotton production. But really, in both versions of the story, so the Soviet version of the story, the Western version of the story, the profound effects of the crisis on the people who lived around the sea, the economic destruction, cultural destruction, and the devastating impact on human health, they've largely been ignored. And one key effect of this, I would argue, is that the sea's demise becomes envisaged largely as an environmental crisis, not as a human one. And we can see this in how the Aral Sea comes to be represented visually. You see these pictures. Some of you may have seen images like this before of the Aral Sea. Well, what's missing in these pictures? People, right? I would argue this is actually more broadly representative of how often climate change is portrayed, particularly in the media, that the physical impact is emphasized, right? Things like the loss of sea ice, the damage to coral reefs. The people who are affected, many of them part of the global South, indigenous groups, they're missing. They're not part of the story. So I'm turning now to the second part of my talk. This, by the way, again, from my travels, this is this nature preserve, Barsa Kelmez. Prior to the sea's retreat, it's an island, and then later it actually becomes part of the shore. If you look down through those cracks there, you can see there's actually a ship buried in the sand, if you look very, very carefully. So the second way let's see. So how do I plan to tell the story differently? What are some of the distinctive features of my approach? One of the things I want to do, and this is sort of a chapter outline of my book, is I tell the story in the longue durée as a way of kind of de-exceptionalizing the Soviet experience. I begin in the late Russian Empire, and I take the story all the way up to the present day. If we do this, we see that the roots of this disaster really start well before the 1960s, before this upsurge in cotton production. Russian imperial officials also talked about draining the sea. They called it, quote unquote, a useless evaporator. And the effects of the loss of the sea have continued to the present day. So just to give you a sense of some of the topics I address, I look at the delimitation of borders under Soviet rule. I look at the construction of the Karakum Canal through Turkmenistan. I look at the health effects. I look at proposals to divert the waters of Siberia to save the sea. I look at climate migration, which becomes a big theme. And I look at what happens after the Soviet collapse, particularly the construction of a dam on the Kazakhstani side in 2005. So I wanted to emphasize, why is the post-Soviet story important? Well, to understand why the post-Soviet story is important, you only need to look at this map. First row up here, this is the Soviet story. And then the second row down there, that's the post-Soviet story. So you see clearly just from this map, this is not just a Soviet story. Look at how much water disappears after the collapse. The second way that I try to tell the story that it's a bit different is that I step away from the national frames in which such stories are usually told. This allows us to see how water, its presence or absence, played a major role in forming some of the identities that we see in the region. It also helps us explain why we see such striking differences between the two sides of the sea today. So if you go to the Uzbekistani side or the Kazakhstani side, it's very striking. These places look really different. By many metrics, the Uzbekistani side is doing worse. The water is much hours and hours away. The conventional answer to why we have these two different outcomes is that, well, and on the Kazakhstani side, in 2005, they built a dam, and that's why we see such difference. But, of course, I'm a historian. I don't accept such answers. Rather than pointing to the dam as the kind of key determinant of these different outcomes, I show that it was actually an accelerant of processes that had long been in motion, and the striking differences between these two national halves of the sea actually have, in fact, much longer roots and genealogies. And to step away from national frames, I really follow the way water flows. One point I want to make is that my book is not so much just about the Aral Sea itself. Instead, it focuses on a region that I call the lands around the sea. And I hope you will excuse my magic marker here. I really struggle with maps with this project. I think I'd need a whole team of map makers to help me, actually, because it's a quite complex, this area, and also the changes in the sea itself. So this area is something that Russian imperial geographers referred to as the Aral, or the lands around the lands near the sea. And it's really been variously defined as states have risen and fallen and borders have shifted over the centuries. I would argue that it's perhaps less an exact place than an idea, right? And a location defined by its relationship with water. It includes the oasis area of the Amu Darya Delta, that would be the southern sort of banks of the sea, as well as the kind of southwestern edge of the Kazakh steppe through which the waters of the CEERES Darya run. It's a really big area. It's about approximate to the size of Texas. And today, more than 6 million people live in this region. It's also very rugged and difficult to access. I promised to show you a lot of photos. Here are a few more. Here's, again, these are all my photos. This is the Ust-Yurg Plateau, which bounds part of the Uzbek side. There are two deserts as well. One kind of separates it internally. Here's another view of the Kazakhstani side. So the rugged sort of geography of the region makes it quite isolated. So it's really tough for outside powers to conquer. But if we look historically, this isolation could also be very generative. It could spark extraordinary creativity and achievement. Historically, the oasis around the Amu Darya actually played a major role in the development of a Turkic literary language and culture. So in my book, I pay particular attention to the shifting national designations of this region, the lands around the Aral Sea under Soviet rule. For instance, one of the things my book shows is actually the Aral Sea was originally fully part of Kazakhstan, and then later they shift part of the sea to Uzbekistan, which is a really important decision. Another important decision, and this is an issue I will bring up again in my talk, is the issue of the Karakalpaks. Karakalpaks are a Turkic-speaking group that live around the southern bank of the sea. And it is decided in the early Soviet period that they're not going to get their own republic. But it is also decided at the same time that they are a distinct people from Kazakhs. There's a lot of debate actually about whether Kazakhs and Karakalpaks are the same people. They're both nomadic, speak a very closely related languages. So very consequentially, the Karakalpaks do not receive their own republic. They are designated an autonomous republic, and they're ruled within Uzbekistan. And this is a situation that persists to the present day and sets up a lot of tensions, because if you remember the way the waters flow, right, the Karakalpaks are downstream, actually. So by and through focusing on these national designations, I'm really interested in exploring how the national and the ecological become intertwined with one another and create this story. By the 1940s, new borders settle into place, and the lands around the sea end up on the rump end of three new republics: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. Two of them border the sea, that's Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And the third, Turkmenistan, actually inherits part of this sort of historic region, part of the Amu Darya Delta. So the lands around the sea are located far from the capitals of these new republics. And I argue it becomes kind of like a double periphery, if you will. So it's far from Moscow, but also really isolated within Central Asia because they're very far from the seats of power. Today, these borders have remained largely in place. And the Russian imperial term, the original term for the region, has shifted in its meaning. It's largely become understood as the term for the disaster zone. So Pre-Aral is synonymous with the idea of an Aral Sea disaster zone. The third way that I try to tell this story a bit differently is that I really work to elevate the voices of ordinary people, particularly rural people in Central Asia, who I think have really been underrepresented in the literature to date. I've done a lot of archival research on this book in state, regional, Communist Party archives throughout the region. I've done about 30 oral history interviews as well to date. And I've also traveled to all three countries that are part of this story, including Turkmenistan. Some of you may know Turkmenistan is one of the most difficult countries in the world to get a visa to. I worked on this for over a year. I have a record of about 100 emails. And I think in the end, I'm probably one of the few Western scholars to visit the country in recent years. So it's a really pretty amazing experience. So with this book, I've also spent a lot of time in rural Central Asia. I really wanted to see what the landscape, the region looked for myself. I camped out in a yurt by the Aral Sea. I've been in fishing boats. I sat for long and bumpy rides across lands with no roads to visit former fishing villages. Many of these fishing villages actually used to be connected to the region by water. When the sea dries up, they become islands in the seabed, so they are not connected by road. They're just sort of islands. Here you can see an example of one, Akes Bay. There were such violent dust storms here that residents are actually forced to flee and because they can't live there anymore. And so they moved to a new settlement, which they also call Akes Bay, New Akes Bay, a couple kilometers away. So this work has really helped me correct the mistaken impression that the sea's demise is purely an environmental crisis rather than a human one. If you talk to people who live in the region, it was clear that the disaster was a human catastrophe in addition to an environmental one. It encompasses economic devastation, cultural destruction, and sweeping impacts on human health. And here's another one of my interviews. This work has really helped me to show that the environmental story can't be told without the human one, that we can't separate out the story in the ways that the kind of Soviet or the Western version of the story have implied. Following other scholars of environmental history, I'm trying to show how the environmental and the human, the nature and culture, are deeply and inextricably intertwined. So turning now to the third part of my talk, I want to talk to you a little bit about the making of the Aral Sea disaster zone. This is a proposal that goes forward in the late Soviet era under Gorbachev. So this is a letter that comes from the archives, and a woman pediatrician, Mavluda Savarova, writes to Gorbachev. She writes, Honored Mikhail Sergeyevich, she writes in a beautiful, this handwritten letter in Russian in a beautiful sloping script. She identifies herself as an ordinary pediatrician, and her note is also signed by 9 other women from the same region. Their message to Gorbachev is quite blunt. They say people who live near the Aral Sea have no future. Central assistance to the region had been poorly implemented. And the Aral Sea disaster in Central Asia, they point out, really has not been accorded the same attention from the center as the 1986 Chernobyl explosion in Ukraine. So Chernobyl, by the way, becomes a big theme. I had no idea. My first book also had this built-in Ukraine comparison. I had no idea that my second book would have one as well. But I'm just flagging this issue because Chernobyl is quite important here, and I will return to it in the conclusion. Savarova estimates that about 70% of men and 85% of women in Kherson, one of the regions near the Uzbekistani side, suffer from various diseases. She says that children are born with birth defects. She has photographs. These photographs are awful. I'm not showing them to you for various reasons. But there's no response from Gorbachev in this file. I didn't know if he ever got a chance to see this letter, if so, how he might have reacted. But I can guess that Safarova must have known as a party member what she was doing, that sick kids in communist society really signal kind of a total breakdown, actually, of the party's promises to uplift and transform society. This was not, the photos themselves show evidence not just of indifference, but a kind of deep betrayal, particularly if you think about Communist Party propaganda, which says, children are our future, puts this on posters. So what kind of future awaits people who live near the sea, of course, if your kids look like that? So Safarova's letter really captures the mood of the Soviet Union's twilight years. This is the period where we see Gorbachev's policies of perestroika or restructuring and glasnost, transparency. This permits greater public discussion of a range of previously forbidden topics, and the disappearance of the Aral Sea is one of them. And so in 1988, nearly 3 decades, I'm always struck by how long it is, after the sea first began its retreat, Moscow finally, officially, and belatedly acknowledges the crisis, including the catastrophic health effects. Soviet scientists now finally and belatedly begin to discuss what might have caused, these health effects. Several different issues are identified, including the spread of toxic dust from the seabed, the contamination of the region's water supply with defoliants, chemical fertilizers. Remember that the Aral Sea is downstream, so it's getting whatever, it's a lake with no outflow, so it's getting all this stuff that's poured into it. Also a drop in the region's food supply, because as the climate changes, crops fail to grow, livestock are dying off, so people are malnourished. There's also a separate and very ugly discourse also going on by some Russian scholars who claim, the people of the Aral Sea, they did this to themselves. That actually people in the region were having too many kids, and in fact, it is the overpopulation of the region that's contributing to this. And I would say a lot of these debates about the causal factors, what actually caused this in terms of the vectors that led to disease and so on, they are still very, very poorly researched to this day. Which also tells you something about how this disaster has been seen, that we still don't understand. Is it the dust? Is it the water? Is it this? Is it that? So the 1988 decree provides the first working definition of the area affected, and it kicks off a subsequent process actually to formally delineate the exact boundaries of the disaster and codify the rights of people who live there. So why did they do this? They do this in part, people push for this work in the region because they want compensation for what they've endured. In the draft legislation, living or working in the disaster zone means things like extra pay, vacation time. The disaster zone is also targeted at halting out-migration, planting people in place. And this work also becomes really important to people in the region because it becomes clear that no other form of assistance is coming. So I mentioned here the river diversion project, this long-running project to divert water from the rivers of Siberia to boost agricultural production in the area and also replenish the sea. That is canceled soon after the Chernobyl nuclear explosion. There are separate debates about doing cloud seeding, actually, but a lot of the mountainous republics in the area, that would be the ones that are upstream, that would be Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, they push back because they say, look, this is going to result in avalanches. This is a totally untested technology. The other thing that is also pushed back at, particularly by the major cotton-growing republics, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, reducing irrigated land, right? Reducing the amount of land given over to cotton. So the disaster zone becomes one of the focal points of research. This is my source for this portion of the book. It's this really amazing source that I was really very, very lucky to get access to. Some of my contacts from my first book meant that I was able to get access to this collection, which is normally closed at the State Archives in Almaty. And the interesting thing about it is it contains documents from all of these different republics. So Turkmenistan, for instance, the archives are essentially off limits there to researchers, but they're collected here in this collection. And the work is done by the Ministry for Nature Protection, but this work of delineating a disaster zone. And this whole project really raises another issue. What was this disaster, right? How can it be defined? It's a very complicated story encompassing environmental degradation, cultural destruction, health, economic collapse. There's no single metric that can say, where it ends and where it begins. It's a regional story, right? Not a national story. And the format of this disaster zone proposal actually encourages national grievances because, of course, the resources are allocated along national lines. So the disaster zone proposal begins to give voice to anguish and human suffering that had long been buried and dismissed. So you see, for instance, individual republics actually lobbying for being individual, say, districts that were excluded from the working definition in 1988. They also begin to articulate their concerns about the sea's disappearance in terms of its effects on human health. You can see a letter here from a district in Kazakhstan where they're saying, hey, I should be included because of, this sort of a massive upsurge in health problems. Different republics also trying to get out ahead and secure assistance. Turkmenistan at this point argues, look, we're the worst affected. They actually go out ahead of Moscow before Moscow has finalized the disaster zone, and they declare parts of Turkmenistan to be a disaster zone before this proposal is finished. So I'll return again to the issue of Karakalpakstan. So this is this republic, autonomous republic within Uzbekistan. They also adopt a similar method to their counterparts in Turkmenistan. They argue that they are the most acutely affected. They list all the diseases, for instance, that people suffer from. The head of Karakalpakstan Supreme Soviet and the chairman of Karakalpakstan's Council of Ministers write that actually out of every 10 kids, one of them dies before their first birthday. And I think it's clear to me at this point, sort of as someone flipping through these files, that obviously it's true that there is some opportunism, right? Here's some jockeying, right, for resources. But I do think there are also really important ways. This is why visiting the region, talking to people is really important. There are ways to also cross-check some of this information that's coming out here about these health effects. So one of the things that's really striking to me is when I went around Karakalpakstan, how many people would tell me that they had kids who died, right, in childbirth or died before the age of 1. If you visit this cemetery in Karakalpakstan, you can see all these rows of actually kids' graves from the period. So Karakalpakstan in particular, I want to emphasize also is a really distinctive case because only here are the effects of the disaster so closely intertwined with the fate of a national group. So Karakalpakstan by this point is about 1/3 Karakalpak, 1/3 Kazakh, 1/3 Uzbek. But Karakalpaks really tend to live in the areas that border the sea, right, the southern edge of the sea. And of course, Karakalpakstan is envisaged as their homeland, right? It bears their name. So some Soviet experts, they actually begin to warn of the disappearance of the Karakalpak nation at this point. And I would argue, particularly in the years following the collapse, the disaster comes to play an important role in shaping what it meant to be Karakalpak. And the Karakalpaks, more than any other group, come to be associated with the sea's demise. So if we look also at Karakalpakstan and Kazakhstan, these would be the areas that border the sea. The strategy they take is they also come to emphasize the cultural and economic impact of the sea's disappearance, even though these are not formally embedded in the disaster zone proposal. They stress, in particular, the need for the preservation and defense of the Aral. The head of the district committee in Moynak, the former port on the Karakalpakstani side, talks about the, quote, incurable pain in his heart, end quote, at the changes to the sea. And so groups of writers and journalists from Kazakhstan, Karakalpakstan, they publish these very evocative literary accounts of the sea that dramatize the stories of fishermen, and they call attention to the fate of the Aral. So this framing has really important emotional appeal and important consequences. As the disaster comes to be more narrowly associated with the sea itself, rather than kind of the far-reaching effects of the disaster, Turkmenistan, the republic that doesn't border the sea, it comes to be sort of written out of the story. If you look historically, there are really, of course, very important connections between the people who became part of northern Turkmenistan and the waters of the Aral. This territory had formed part of Khwarezm. This is this large oasis region located on the Amu Darya Delta. Later, it becomes known as the Haneda of Khiva before its constituent parts are split among several Central Asian republics, including Turkmenistan. But as the story begins to be told in in national frameworks rather than all union frameworks, Turkmenistan is increasingly written out. So as this disaster zone proposal goes on, the environmental conditions around the sea worsen. In Turkmenistan, in Tashavuz, trees would turn white. They're kind of encrusted, actually, in salt. People would tell me that the air was really thick, kind of and heavy, difficult to breathe, and people started to flee. So the migration starts first on the Uzbekistani side because the waters start to recede there earlier. And then later it hits about, the Kazakhstani side is about a decade behind the Uzbekistani side of the story. Small villages that border the sea empty out, in particular, the former port of Aralsk begins to swell. People go to places like Alma-Ata, Kazakhstan's capital. They go to Ashgabat, the capital of Turkmenistan. If we look at this is also a particularly poignant story that I came across, that this guy here, he is named a captain of the fishing industry, hero of socialist labor. Well, he ends up being a hero of socialist labor who's unemployed, and he ends up going to Almaty looking for work because he can't be a fisherman anymore. And this was really one of the more interesting parts of the project for me, was actually interviewing a lot of people who had fled to these areas. I do want to point out the Karakalpaks, with their migration routes, they tended to follow these paths of cultural connection. So many of them went actually back to Kazakhstan because it was a place that was more closely linked kind of culturally and linguistically than the unit in which they were housed, Uzbekistan. The disaster zone proposal, of course, assumes that people could be fixed in place, right? You're going to give these benefits to people who live in a certain place. But those who fled this disaster, they actually carry the effects of the disappearance with them. So I was able to do some oral history interviews with members of the Turkmen diaspora. You can't do oral history in Turkmenistan itself. That is a no-go. But with some caution and assurances of anonymizing and changing every detail, you can do with members of the Turkmen diaspora who are from Dashavuz. And so they told me quite amazing things about, they would come to Ashgabat, they would come in for a scan, and the doctors would say, look at their kidneys and say, hey, I can tell you from Dashavuz, right? Because of the number of kidney stones. Officials in the region continue to haggle over the financial details of the proposed disaster zone. Many people clearly understand, look, this is a Band-Aid on a larger problem. And they also understood that, what is this FR doing, right? It's just offering people rewards, right, to take risks with their health. And this is an idea, of course, that has a much longer genealogy in both capitalist and communist societies. The head of Kazakhstan's Committee for Hydrometeorology points out as much. He says that, without radical changes to the region's water supply, the sea is going to continue to be strangled. He said everything else is just wasting time. A delay here is as good as death. But in the context of this collapsing empire, where key resources like attention, funds are running short, it isn't really clear that people had a lot of choice, right? They needed to extract what they could. And indeed, time did run out. The Soviet Union was dissolved on December 26, 1991, and the Soviet version of the disaster zone proposal is never finalized. And so here I want to turn to my conclusions. What might this particular part of the story about this unfinished disaster zone proposal have to teach us? And what might the Aral Sea story reveal more generally? So I should point out here that the Aral Sea disaster zone actually it was never finalized in the Soviet period, has a pretty important post-Soviet afterlife. So if we look around the region, in Turkmenistan, the disaster, this is the outlier. So there's no longer any recognized disaster zone in the country. The effects of the sea's disappearance are not really acknowledged as a problem. Turkmenistani scientists pursue climate mitigation efforts in the affected area very quietly. But residents of Dasha was told me, look, we are so fearful of state repression that sometimes they avoid even discussing the weather over the telephone. Kazakhstan, by contrast, actually adopts a disaster zone model that really closely follows the Soviet one. And if you talk about fresh from the archives, I took this photograph 2 weeks ago in Astana, actually. This is a photograph. I was working in the post-1991 archive, and I came across, this is like a working map, essentially, of how they plan to implement the Soviet disaster zone proposal. And like the Soviet one, they basically take the same borders. They have the same levels of risk, so different gradations of how badly they think these areas are affected. Uzbekistan, by contrast, has taken an entirely different approach. So we still see tensions lingering with the Karakalpak minority. This is a really important part of the story. 2022, actually, there's uprisings in Karakalpakstan because Uzbekistan tries to change the constitution so that Karakalpakstan is not able to secede. A number of people are killed. So what do they do with this disaster zone? Well, they make it into an international tourist site. You can see here the so-called ship graveyard right there. And you can see how the ships are sort of lined up right neatly. And first off, this is actually not the harbor at all of where it was. And then when I started to talk to people in the region, they'd say, yeah, that was actually done in 2010. They brought these ships from all over the region because the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, was coming and his head team came and said he wants to see ships. So they lined up all the ships here very neatly. And so on this side of the sea, kind of dark tourism has become popular. You can see people strolling among the ships, posting dramatic selfies of the ruins of the first socialist state on Instagram. The old Soviet concept of the disaster zone has also been subject to a rebrand. In 2021, as you can see here, they get the UN to declare it a zone of ecological innovation and technology, which on one level seems to promise assistance, including the introduction of water-saving technologies, tree planting, but on the other hand, I would argue is also about erasure and erasing some forms of Karakalpak heritage. So returning back to this broader Soviet context and the disaster zone, another observation which I've already hinted at is, just how long it takes them to recognize the Aral Sea disaster, more than 30 years, which is very striking. And again, if we return to the theme of Chernobyl, other interesting comparisons and observations emerge. Both of these disasters are environmental and human disasters. So they have catastrophic environmental effects, catastrophic human effects. But Chernobyl is recognized as a public health disaster right away. The disaster zone is delineated right after the explosion in 1986. And the Aral Sea story struggles to get recognized as a public health story in the same way. And that struggle is still ongoing to this day. And this is something that gets Aral Sea activists really annoyed. The letter by the female pediatrician that I showed you, she brings it up, and Chernobyl becomes a really constant reference point and rallying cry. I would argue that the disaster zone proposal also serves as a corrective to a literature that has, to my mind, overly stressed Central Asia's quiescence in the Soviet project. Particularly if you look at the Soviet collapse, the kind of common trope is that Central Asia played no role, that this was a place that was heavily subservient to Moscow, and in the Soviet Union's final days, and this was in part due to heavy investment in the region from the center. And I think this kind of misconception has come about for a couple of reasons. I would argue what I see as kind of a lingering conservatism in the Soviet field, the failure to adopt perhaps new methodologies like oral history, or also to bring in new approaches like environmental justice. I would argue more broadly, if we look at environmental justice in Central Asia, this is a really under-researched topic, and there's a lot of issues actually ranging from Semipalatin's nuclear disaster to oil deals that were brokered in haste with Western companies as the Soviet Union collapses kind of behind closed doors. And if you look closely at the region and these rural voices that to date have been underrepresented in the literature, in fact, we see a much more dynamic picture. We see citizens pushing back, making claims for resources, equitable treatment, human rights. And these voices really call into question the idea that Central Asia was heavily subsidized by Moscow. And this is sort of a key concept I want to attack. When we consider what people around the sea endured, what does subsidy even mean, right? It no longer seems to hold any meaning, I would argue. The story I've tried to tell is also perhaps a little bit different than most of the Soviet environmental history literature, which has emphasized the overweening presence of the state in the making of environmental catastrophes. Here, the issue is not so much state presence, but also state absence, the underdevelopment of the region, the lack of things like modern medical services, running water, or even electricity, all of which come to amplify the effects of the disaster. There are distinctive aspects to the Aral Sea case, including things like Moscow's reliance on a very pesticide-heavy form of cotton farming, the push to catch up and overtake the West in a very short period of time, the secrecy also of the Soviet state. There's a whole bioweapons testing story that I didn't even get into here with the Aral Sea, and also the general underdevelopment of the region, which I've referenced above. But consigning the Aral Sea disaster to the distant past as something purely Soviet neglects the fact, as I hinted at the outset, that this is not a totally unique story. It shares common features, of course, with other shrinking bodies of water in arid regions. In all these examples, there are dust storms, regional climate changes, species die-off, human health problems that are very strikingly similar to the Aral Sea case. And the Aral Sea case is in many respects a harbinger of our own future. Thinking back to the broader climate change literature too, I think that the people of the Aral Sea have something to teach us as well. When we think about how climate change is portrayed in the media, it's often portrayed as kind of like an elegy, right? And I will show you the ship adrift in the sand again, so you get a sense of what I mean. Taken on their own, these images without people might appear as an expression of loss and of sorrow. They suggest that actually the end of the story is known. And this too is representative of how accounts of climate change in the global south are often framed. Because local people are not highlighted, the implication is that many of these people, indigenous or otherwise, collapsed or fled in the face of radical environmental change. But if we take a closer look at the history of people who live around the sea, we certainly see accounts of loss and sorrow, but we also see something very different. Stories of energy, adaptation, and hope. And by spotlighting local voices, these local voices that I seek to highlight in my book, I hope to bring that out. And with that, I'll close with this image of the fishing ship, which is where I began. Thank you.
Don't mind identifying yourself before you're.
Brendan White, I'm the map curator here. You say it's not just an ecological disaster, but also a human disaster. Is it possible to have an ecological disaster without it also being a human disaster?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the two are intertwined. That's what I guess I was trying to bring out, like that it's a very false version of the story to separate them out in this way. So yes, it's both. I don't think it's possible to have one without the other.
Thanks. Wonderful story and evidence and pictures too. I just raised my hand because I had the exact same question actually, but I just want to follow up, right? You presented as, center to human and the human crisis as opposed to the empty ships without the humans, right? But you obviously recognize that the two are linked. So I guess my question is, how should we think about those linkages, right? Like there's sort of across humanities and social science, there's a lot of thinking about this nexus. And lots of, I guess a lot of Soviet historians have also thought about that. Like, what is it, right? Like the story of the dominance and the subordination of nature, and then other alternatives. So I guess I was just going to push you a little further to how you think about that nexus during times of crisis. And then maybe a somewhat related question is, just to pile on more things, is do you have any thoughts on the concept of ecocide? Because again, bringing in Ukraine, that is now the concept that Ukrainian activists are actually proposing and also advocating for, to just get at different aspects of environmental crisis during war. Thanks. Lots of questions.
Thank you. These are great questions. I can't say I have great answers here. I guess in terms of thinking about these linkages, I don't think that I have a theory yet, perhaps, of how they operate, but I have been influenced by people like the work of Andy Bruno, right, who's looked at, say, Stalinism as an ecosystem and argued, that the environment was something that both kind of like constrained and empowered, right, Soviet ideology at different points. I don't think that there has been so much work on the role of, with the exception perhaps of the work of Maya Peterson, that there has been so much work on the role of water or of Central Asia in this context. So perhaps that's something distinctive, right? That I hope to bring to the story. So I guess it depends. So I worked a lot in my previous project with this idea of genocide, right? And all of these things, of course, depend upon the definition that you assign to them. So I think perhaps depending upon the definition, right, it could be classified as ecocide.
Okay, we have an online question from our colleague Jeff Eden at Northwestern. So Jeff says, this is amazing research and a superb presentation. Thank you so much. It's remarkable that you were able to travel inside Turkmenistan for this project. How was your research received among Turkmens you met in the country? And did you perceive suspicion and hostility there, or receptiveness and helpfulness more common?
So I should say that my view of Turkmenistan was pretty limited. So I was a guest actually of the U.S. State Department because that was the only way to get there, right? The only other way to get there is a tourist visa, but then you're going to be minded and going on all these trips and sort of closely scrutinized, if you will. And so I felt that this was the only way that I could go. I needed to be open about what I was doing. I had hoped to go to Dashawuz. I didn't go to Dashawuz. I only went to Ashgabat, and I gave talks at 2 universities, and I met with Turkmen colleagues. You probably saw the shot there. I always joke it's the most intensive group students I've ever had, because all the students were lined up in rows, and there was someone sort of patrolling the aisles to make sure that they were laser focused on me. But it was pretty interesting. I have to say that I was very intrigued by their interest in climate change issues. That's how my visit was framed, is about climate change. So I came in and I think they were a little perhaps disappointed that I was a historian rather than, say, a water engineer. But I came in and, people say, well, we have something to talk about, and they also said, climate change, this is human induced. And I guess if one is very cynical, you might say that, well, some countries in the global south have an incentive, right, to see climate change as an issue because it's also a financial question, right, receiving resources from the global north. But at the same point, I guess I was struck by the range of activity and work that was going on by Turkmen scholars, particularly in Dashawuz. So that was pretty interesting. There was only a kind of certain range of topics that I could broach with them, and I was also I didn't have the same read on what might be sensitive in Turkmenistan, so I was a little hesitant of upending things in my visit. In fact, I gave my presentation when I went there about the demise of the Great Salt Lake, because I didn't want to talk about the Aral Sea and kind of get myself in trouble, and I thought that would naturally lead to comparison, which it did. So it was pretty interesting to see the range of projects that people were working on in the area of climate mitigation, the interest in collaboration with Western colleagues on that. The other thing that has also been interesting is just talking to members of the Turkmen diaspora. And the way I usually sell it is I say, well, look, Turkmenistan is so underrepresented in the historical scholarship. I get quite irritated by myself, actually, that there's this sort of almost this thinking like, okay, we can't go there. And so that's we're not going to write about it and we're not going to include it in overviews. But if you think about it, there are so many other parts of the world where it's very difficult to do research. Xinjiang might be a good example, right, where there's this explosion of research, amazing research. So why can't we write Turkmenistan back into the story? And so I tried to sort of sell it that way. And I would say, look, I really want to make sure your country is represented. Then they would tell me things, which was great. But I also understand that this was a very stressful experience for many of them. And so that's definitely something very paramount in my mind is trying to make sure their identities are kept anonymous and so on.
Hi, my name is James Nee. I'm a PhD candidate in history here at U Chicago. I've read and reread The Hungry Step tons of times since like 2019, so it's really cool to see you talk. Your talk brought to mind Alisher Haliarov's article in Central Asian Survey earlier this year, where he's talking about like global cooling and the Aral Sea and the Khanate of Khiva. So it got me think just on the other side of that, what's the role of global warming in your story? Thank you.
Yeah. So it's thank you. It's not an easy question to pick out actually, because I don't think that we could ever sort of say like 30% is this and 70% is this. I taught a course on the history of I taught a course this past spring on the history of global warming. And the students and I looked a little bit, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the whole idea of like attribution science. It's a science where basically scientists sit around and they try to, they look at like a hurricane and they try to discuss whether it can be attributed to climate change. And it's a very important science, but also quite fraught, right, in terms of how it's presented to the public. So it's really interesting to look at some of that. So I think broadly we can say yes. So climate change the disaster initially is very much its causes are about the diversion of water for cotton production. But climate change clearly becomes important later on. And Central Asia is one of the world regions that is most exposed to climate change. It's identified by this as by the IPCC. So clearly that is playing an increasingly important role in the story. But at the same point, it's clear that a lot of the cotton production has not subsided either, these water withdrawals. So it's something that becomes more important, I would say, as the story goes on.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Yelnora Tanasbekova. I study at the Middle Eastern Studies Center. I'm from Kazakhstan. I was at this exhibition in Astana this summer on the drying up of the Caspian Sea. And I came in a bit later. I didn't get the beginning of your lecture, but what I grasped was that like different countries have different attitudes towards the Aral Sea catastrophe, like in Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, as you mentioned. Like I would ask, like, what is your opinion of like the Caspian issue right now? Because it's also like it connects many countries like Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Iran. Would you say like this different kind of attitudes would result in something that we have regarding the Aral Sea right now, but like ongoing countries kind of treating the environmental issues in a different way and having different economic agendas because, well, they are obviously not trying to stop the environmental crisis. There is like the bigger goal of like catching up with the West in economical sense.
So the question is basically, do I think that the Caspian Sea is going to kind of resemble the Aral Sea?
Yeah, I guess.
In some ways.
Yeah.
Well, maybe the Caspian story, I guess, would be, so it's really interesting. When I was just in the archives, I was reading all these amazing documents. A lot of, in the late Soviet, or actually after the collapse a lot of people, the experts who are working on the Aral Sea problem are also working on the Caspian problem. There's a lot of overlap actually in expertise, which is pretty interesting. So at the same point that the Aral Sea is continuing to dry up after the collapse, the Caspian is overflowing its banks. This is a big problem. It's actually water excess, not water shortage. But now again, as you point out, we see the Caspian drying up. I think the story, my hunch here, the story is going to be a bit different because the Caspian is so important in terms of transport. The Aral Sea, there is a transport story to the Aral Sea in part because fish, cotton gets shipped across from, there's not a direct railroad connection on the Uzbekistani side. There is a direct railroad connection from Aralsk on the Kazakhstani side. And so the shipping across the sea from Karakol, Pakistan to Aralsk is really, really important. But in the case of the Caspian, we see shipping as, shipping is really crucially important for, transport of things like oil and gas. And so that would be my hunch, is that perhaps you will see a lot more attention to this story, in part because of the really important role that it plays in terms of energy.
All right, we have two more questions from online guests. I'll post them together. So the first is, since the USSR collapsed, a lot of international money has been spent on saving the sea. There's a permanent international committee to save the Aral in Central Asia. And the question asker comments that much of this has been driven by local elites. So they want to know how that fits into the story. The second question is, are there any historians or others in Russia currently looking at these issues? And is a cooperation or collaboration with them possible at this time?
Okay, the second one I can answer pretty quickly. No. So there are actually some, not historians looking at the Aral Sea in Russia, but ichthyologists in particular, water experts, and some of these people, I guess you could call it sort of collaboration. I've definitely had some email contact dialogue with, because this is a very interdisciplinary project. You might imagine that I often run up against some pretty technical questions, and I find that they can actually be really helpful in answering those technical questions. Nonetheless, for obvious reasons, I'm not interested in sort of collaboration. Some of them put on actually Aral Sea conferences, online Aral Sea conferences I've listened in, but I don't want to present at these conferences because they're at Russian state institutions. Nonetheless, I would say that this generation of Russian scientists, many of them became active in the Aral Sea problem in the late 1980s. They're now of a certain generation. They're all of an older generation. And because they're of an older generation, I don't know how many of them are actually going out to the sea anymore. And that is one of the problems that I face in this book. One of the big challenges, I feel like the endpoint of the story is constantly changing, actually. That, the species that survived there 2 years ago in the sea is no longer there, and so on. And I find, I'm reading their works and I think, oh, I was just there actually, and I didn't, this looks a bit different. So there are Russian scientists working on it of this older generation, but no historians that I have found. So after the collapse, that's exactly right. There is an organization formed called the International Fund for Saving the Aral Sea, because the worry essentially is that, well, this was all part of one system before, the Soviet Union. And the Aral Sea Basin, this is another term. So the Aral Sea Basin essentially refers to all 5 Central Asian states. So it's much larger than the region that I was just talking about. And all 5 Aral Sea Basin states become part of this fund for saving the Aral Sea. But from everything I have been able to understand, the fund for saving the Aral Sea is actually not very effective in water management. It is underfinanced. It also faces the problem that these water issues look quite differently in different countries. So Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan think, well, we are water-rich countries, right? We are upstream, right? They're not so interested in the story. Others say, is saving the Aral Sea really our goal anymore, right? Should we be changing the name of the organization? The other problem is that some of these bureaucrats, as sort of the question points out, they've never don't really understand a lot of the conditions in these rural regions. So they're sort of absent from kind of the story of local people, right? They're not engaged in that story. So, I mean, it's difficult to say kind of But I think, yeah, each kind of nation has shaped the story in distinctive ways.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and listening to how you talk about pre-Aral, it really brings to mind that that's not really a geographic terminology. It seems more like a social condition, because it does seem to organize how the Karakalpaks think of themselves in relation to water, think of themselves in relation to the state. So my question is, thinking of the pre-Aral, like what you can take the Karakalpaks out of the Aral Sea, but can you take the Aral Sea out of the Karakalpaks? So when they are migrating to the cities, like you mentioned, Alimbetov, I want to know, is there a legacy? Does the Aral still haunt them? Does it affect how they articulate their maybe medical troubles, how they identify as global victims of climate change? Just things like that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, great question. I think there's a lot more to be done on this question, and so it's a wonderful question. I think the more I got into this project, I felt like one could write a different story from the perspective of culture, actually, because there's just an explosion of film and of art and of books it's really astonishing, actually expressing some of this trauma, right, if you will. So. So the Karakalpaks, it is really interesting. Their whole culture, in many ways, many of the key cultural symbols are connected with water. So the Karakalpak national anthem features the word Jaipun, which refers to it's a kind of a local word for the Amu Darya, for the river. This is really quite interesting. And I think for Karakalpak too, the fact that so many of them have had to migrate and leave, it's also the absence of water and the absence of the sea has become a story about cultural loss too, as well. Just when I was just in Uzbekistan, I met with a Karakalpak activist who was telling me about all his efforts at kind of indigenous language preservation, at preserving the Karakalpak language. He was saying, well, the kids, they all just watch, like Uzbek comics and so on. I want them to watch Karakalpak comics. He's also very upset that there's no Google Translate for Karakalpak because there's not enough Karakalpak, right, on the internet. And I think actually, if one of the really interesting literatures that's been a point of comparison for me in this project, which is more developed, would be, say, the literature on environmental history in Native American groups. There has been a lot of work on kind of cultural preservation. For instance, efforts to preserve cultural symbols, if you will. So for instance, efforts by Native American groups to preserve like the caribou, for instance, as a kind of cultural symbol, even though people don't hunt these groups anymore. And I was also struck by some of these efforts too, both on the Kazakhstani side and also on the Uzbekistani side. In the beginning, I would see all these symbols of kind of fish, like even fish and fishing boats woven into the wrought iron railings. And I think, that's, the sea, that's far away. Like, why are they doing this? And then I sort of began to learn a little bit more, and I began to think about it. I thought, well, maybe this is also a method of cultural preservation, right? Teaching, maintaining this kind of cultural coherence, right, if you will.
Hello, and thank you for the presentation. My name is Chloe. I'm an undergraduate here studying history. And I was really interested about the sources that you encountered, particularly what you discovered in state archives and how they intersect with the role, as you say, of like state absence, which amplifies disaster. Namely, how do you see that absence or policies of absence reflected in the archives? Is there a sort of industrial overtone, and how is that silence disputed by locals, both in oral history and your own work, and possibly at the time? And is there a possibility of recovering that?
So I see it in a couple ways. One is, I've always been struck sometimes how these sort of typical accounts of Soviet modernization don't match up with my own experiences in Central Asia and what I see with my eyes. The fact, so for instance, even in the 1970s, some of these fishing villages, they didn't have running water. They had electricity 1 hour a day. And I think what the departure of the sea, the retreat of the state, it really lays bare these gaps and insufficiencies. They become kind of exacerbated, right, if you will. I guess also you were asking about I think, gaps in local people's understanding. Is that right?
Or rather, is the gap in state knowledge rectified by gaps in local understanding?
No, I mean, I did notice it was really interesting. People did seize on to certain, so of course, Soviet ideas. I didn't get a chance to show it in this talk, but one of my favorite images, you can see it all around Aralsk. According to local lore, during the Civil War, Lenin calls upon the people of Aralsk to feed the starving, and they send wagons of fish. And this mural is sort of everywhere, actually, around Aralsk, and people are very, very proud of it. They're like, we saved we saved Lenin, we saved the Soviet Union, right? This is still, but I guess I would say another thing that sort of really struck me was also the differences in chronologies, actually. So that this place didn't seem to fit and does not seem to fit often when I try to fit it into kind of typical chronologies that we think of in the Soviet period. It doesn't fit some of those. So just to give you an example, normally we think of the Brezhnev era as this period of peace and tranquility and sort of consumerism, and it was not that at all, right? For people, this is the heart of the crisis, when people are really suffering, when there are all these medical problems. So I found that out also, of course, in part through these oral history interviews.
Okay, I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a final question then. And I'm sorry to ask a question that a little bit takes you away from what you talked about today, but I was really intrigued by your passing observation that both of your works have found these really interesting parallels between Kazakhstan and Ukraine. So I hope this is fair game in the sense that you're kind of pushing the boundaries of Soviet history and making us rethink the role of center and periphery. Do you think that's happenstance, or do you think there's something structural that is happening between, or some kind of exchange happening between Ukraine and Kazakhstan? What do you make of that?
Oh, wow, I admit I hadn't thought about it in that way. More it's just sort of called, for me, it's made very clear the unevenness in our field, right? That like again and again, I see these problems that have really important parallels in the Ukrainian case, but wait a minute, everyone knows about the Ukrainian case and no one's heard of the others or researched them. So clearly there are kind of structural imbalances, right, in the field. So basically whether these two problems are tied together in some ways.
I'm kind of thinking of Kate Brown's article, why Kazakhstan and Montana are the same place, right? Like finding these interesting parallels or connections between two disparate places. And so I'm just wondering if there's some kind of logic, or again, if it's just...
I guess we can see that at certain points, both, like if we take the first problem, the issue, the famine, right? Both Kazakhstan and Ukraine, they become resource-rich. They're resource-rich societies from the perspective of Stalin and others in those periods. So they're grain-producing republics, and they're also republics where the populations are seen as foreign or as alien. One peasant, one nomadic. And I guess I think more in the case of the Aral Sea story, I'm struck also by. In the case of the two famines, right? So Ukrainian famine and Kazakh famine, they were both treated horribly, right? But in the case of, if we see the case of Chernobyl and the case of the Aral Sea, there are some very clear and striking differences actually in how those two problems emerge. And you might say, well, one issue, of course, is that we are dealing with a nuclear disaster versus this other sort of disaster, which doesn't seem to fit standard definitions, and maybe people react to nuclear disasters in different ways. But I am struck in particular in this project by, I think there's an undercurrent, maybe even of racism here, right? That perhaps we don't see, right? In the Ukrainian case, I'm struck in particular by, that this disaster goes on for more than 30 years. And they don't do anything. And that, to me, it's hard to explain that away, actually. And so I've started, in some of my research, even referring to, the Aral Sea as a crime. I think we need to start talking about it in that way.
Well, thank you for such a thought-provoking and enriching talk. And for everyone here, we'll have some snacks where we can
Yeah.
continue the conversation. Thank you again.
Thanks.